So I'm beginning a new series, which I mentioned last week. I'm going to do a series on identity. If you remember back to, those of you who are here, back at the beginning of 2020, I did a Vision 2020 thing, which all began with eyes that God had given me. And I thought it was time maybe we pressed into identity, because it is a key thing for us, you know, who we are. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be thinking both identity in terms of who we are individually, but also spending some time as well in the series thinking about who we are corporately. Because despite our very individualistic culture, we actually do have a corporate identity that we're part of, which often gets lost in these days of self-centeredness and individuality. So we'll be thinking about that as well. So it's one of the great questions, isn't it, of our time, really, of who we are. And I think, you know, we've become sort of lost as to who we are. So I've actually titled the talk "Identity Lost," and this is kind of an overview this morning, an introduction. I won't say gentle introduction. It might be gentle. It might not. I don't know really. But anyway, so we're thinking about who we really are, and it's a question that we all wrestle with. When I was working at Peterborough Council, we all, predictably of course, had identity cards, and one of the no-nos, of course, was to forget your ID card, which I only managed to do, I think, once when I travelled over to Peterborough and finally I can't get into the building because you know the ID card gets you through all the doors and stuff into the building, as well as having a rather nasty mugshot of me on it. But even say then you had to go and grovel to the receptionist and say, "Right, I really do work here," and you can verify it with somebody, and they give you a spare to get you in. But the real no-no was to actually lose your card. I mean, you know, that was the thing you really weren't supposed to do. But from time to time, people did, and got into real trouble about it, you know, because they had a replacement and all the rest of it. So you know, it was a no-no to lose your ID. But in many ways, I think that's the position we're in as a culture, particularly in the West. We've lost our ID, we've lost our identity. We don't know who we are anymore. I mentioned this before, I think, but you know I'm a bit of a fan of Ice Age. I love the Ice Age series of kind of animated films, and in Ice Age 2, we get introduced to Ellie, who's the female woolly mammoth, and when she's first introduced, I think Manny, the one who's been in the first one, comes across her, and she's up a tree, and he said, "What are you doing up the tree?" And she says, "Well, I'm a possum," because you see she'd been orphaned as a young child, and so she was sort of brought up by these two possums who also then become part of the story. But she's convinced that she's a possum, even though she's a huge, gigantic woolly mammoth. That's all she's known. That's how she's been brought up. So she's a possum. So she's confused about her identity, and that's us really, as human beings. We're lost and confused. And as I've I tend to try and sort of analyse society a bit, and you know, it's part of, I suppose, my job as a preacher and a pastor. But what I've noticed in my lifetime is that sense of identity has become more confused, not less. Even though we have more choice as to who we are, more choice as to what we do, more information, and yet we've become more and more confused. And you know, certainly the younger generation growing up, I think, are more confused than ever about who they are. And I guess maybe that's because of the choice. And the pressure and all the rest of it that we're under. You know, it's like I'm renowned if I'm going into a car park, if it's really busy and there's only one or two spaces, I can, well, I know I've got to grab that space or one of those spaces very quickly. If I go into a virtually empty car park, I think, where shall I go? Where shall I park? I'm suddenly confused. I think, you know, should I park over there? No, maybe it's better over there. Or, you know, so, you know, Helen gets frustrated. She says, just go park somewhere. You know, but I'm confused by the choice, really, almost. It's better for me if I just go there. So yeah, we're confused by the choice we have. And it's all down to the fact that we've lost our connection with God. And I don't know whether you know the story of, I'm sure you've heard the story of Pandora's box. It's one of the Greek legends. It's actually originally in the original story, it was probably more of one of those storage jars with a cover on it. But anyway, the story is that Pandora's husband was given this jar or box to look after by the gods, and under strict instructions that it wasn't to be opened. He just had to look after it and not open it. But in the story, Pandora gets rather intrigued by this jar or box or whatever it was, as you do. You know, when you're told you mustn't open something, it's like kind of, if nobody had said that, you wouldn't bother. But because you're told you can't open it, you think, oh, I'm intrigued, what's in it? Anyway, in the story, of course, she eventually succumbs and opens it up. And in the story, all the evils of the world are then released from this box. And I think it's an interesting picture, but it's an interesting picture of the Garden of Eden and the loss that happened. And one of the things I think that got lost in all of that rebellion in the Garden of Eden was this sense of identity. And it's not something we often think about. You know, we think about lostness in many other ways, but our identity was lost and who we are. And you know, we're left trying to work that all out in a society with lots of lies about who we are. You know, I'm intrigued by the fact that in adverts, they can promise you a new identity in all sorts of ways. You know, there's one going around at the moment about straightening your teeth. And if you sign up for this company and they straighten your teeth, suddenly you have a new identity, you're a new person. And you can do that in lots of ways, you know, that's what the world is promising. Do this and you'll find yourself, you'll find out who you are. And, you know, we are living in the ultimate age of the image. It's all about the image, you know, that people create. And we spend millions of pounds on body image or on clothes image or on a lifestyle image. And yet, at the end of it, we're no more happy as a culture because we're not really tuning into where we should be. So we're going to explore in this series, and it's really an invitation to explore who we really are and to come into alignment with who God says we are. And that's the key thing. So these are some questions that you might want to be just asking. Even as Christians, do you love Jesus but struggle to value yourself? I guess we're all there sometimes. Do you find yourself in competition with others? Do you find that you're easily offended with inconsequential matters, you know, things that really don't matter? Do you hate yourself or your life at times? And if you know, as we answer those questions and think about them all personally, they're clues to whether you are still struggling with an identity. Right. Onwards. I've just got 4 very short readings, actually, mostly one verse, that I'm going to base this around. And these, if you remember nothing else from this talk, these verses are gold. This is Acts 17:28, which is where Paul is preaching in Athens. And he says in this verse, "For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." And that word being is an identity word. And in fact, the Passion Version translates it this: it's through him that we live and function and have our identity. Very interesting. This is Romans 11:36. "For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." Colossians 1:16-17. "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." And then lastly, 1 Corinthians 2:9. However, it's written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has conceived. These are the things that God has prepared for those who love him. So I'm going to just use some thoughts from those scriptures to give us an introduction to this. And I think it says a few things about identity that we need to have as foundation. The first thing is that identity is derived and not created. Identity is derived and not created. That's that bit from Romans 11, that we're from him. Therefore, that's where identity comes from. We often think that we've got to create an identity for ourselves. That's what the world's busy doing, really. It's creating an identity. Shall I be this or shall I be that? Or, whatever it is. I'm trying to create a persona, and hopefully one that somebody approves of and loves and likes and, makes me look good. And one of the cultural lies, I've probably mentioned this before again, but is this idea that in our world you can be whoever you want to be. And that in some ways comes from a good intention, not to be restricted in our thinking and so on. But actually it's not quite true. It's only a half truth. We know we can't be whoever we want to be. It's just not possible, not always. If you don't have the right intellect or personality or the looks or something, there's things you can't be, and that sort of mantra creates casualties in our world, because for those that can't succeed because of whatever, then suddenly, where am I? How do I fit in? It's that sense that I'm a failure because I can't do what the world says I should or what I want to desire. So we can't create an identity of anything that we want to be. We're made in the image of God, and we're made by him. And I find that if it's down to me to create an image for myself, to create an identity, then I become very obsessed with me. It becomes all about me. How am I being received? What do people think of me? How am I being accepted? All of those questions that become sort of very fundamental to our lives and hearts. If I'm making my own image and making my own identity, that's what I'm worried about. I become very obsessed. Or we become like chameleons. We think, what should I be in this particular circumstance? And how chameleons are able to change their colour depending on their environment. And often we feel that we've got to do that. We've got to fit in. So we've got to change, and we try and become something we're not. Or we just put on masks and hide ourselves. I remember those. Was it those Mr. Potato Heads? Were they the ones that you got loads of things and you could put a moustache on or a hat or something, and you could keep changing and making yourself making the potato head into a new identity, and that's sometimes I know that's me. I'm just changing to feel good or fit in or whatever. But that's just a very pressured way of living. And when we create our own identity, then I've noticed that what happens is two things happen. Either extreme. Either we get very aggressive about who we are, and I guess you've all met those sorts of people who have an identity they're very aggressive about. This is me, accept me or not, whatever, there's a lot of aggression around identity in our culture. How dare you say that about me? Or, it's very, very aggressive. Or we become very anxious. We're just constantly anxious about who we are or who we aren't or whatever, or we want to be like somebody else and we can't. So there's a lot of pressure to get it right. And in our media-driven culture, it's all the more, because social media is a lot about image. It's a lot about identity. And so this is who, and you feel that you've got to compete with somebody else, and it's just so much pressure. I often think about, if we create our identity around something that we do or are. I mean, I'd hate to be a well-known comedian, because that's their identity. That's who people see that they are. And I just imagine the pressure of always having to be funny. whatever circumstance you go in, if somebody meets you, you feel I've got to come up with some witty one-liner. What kind of pressure's that? I'd hate it. Or so you know what I mean. Once you get your identity really linked into something that you do or are, it can be really, really pressure-filled. So part of this journey that we're on is that we want to come into line with who God says we are. Not who somebody else says we are, not who we feel we might be even, not who we think we might think we are, but who He says we are. And that includes our natures, and part of our identity is how God has made us, and we're all in that sense different. We have different natures and personalities. And it's taken me a long time to become comfortable with being an introvert. There have been many occasions when that's me, that's who I am. But there have been many occasions, and it's been a lifetime of growing into that. Okay, that's who God has made me. I can live with that. I don't have to be the life and soul of the party. I never will be, probably. So it's becoming comfortable with that. You might be the other extreme, of course, and then that's also fine. But whatever our differences in personalities are, we can, in God, come to peace with it, because He's created us that way. So that's key. Identity is derived and not created. Identity is formed in connection, not isolation. You notice a lot of those passages were about connection. We're from Him, we're for Him. I love that bit in Colossians where it says, in Him everything holds together. Everything hangs together in Jesus. That passage in Colossians about Jesus. As I was thinking about this particular part of it, I got around to thinking about an electric socket. It's a very deep existential question, this. When is an electric socket an electric socket? Well, I was thinking, if you disconnect the cables in the back of the electric socket and it becomes dead in that sense, it has no connection, is it really an electric socket anymore? Is it really just a plastic box with some holes in it? Its identity changes, doesn't it? It's not really an electric socket because there's no electric. And that reminded me that actually, we can't just have our identity in a vacuum or in isolation. We're not made that way. We're made to be connected. We're made and designed to thrive in the presence of God. So we can't do that in outside of that deepest, most important, fundamental relationship. It's that gives us our identity. And so, if we're not in connection with God, then we end up in sort of rootlessness and restlessness, because we're made to be in Him. We're from Him and for Him. And also, as we'll think about in the talks as we go on, we actually do have a community identity. As strange as that seems in our individualistic society, we actually do have and are made for a place and a role within community and society, and that identity is key for us as well. We can only really come into who we are within the context of community, within the context of family and in relationship, but primarily in relationship with God. So, we can't come to know who we are in the deepest sense in isolation from God. Now here's another revolutionary statement. Identity is not for us, but it's for God. Identity is not for us, it's for God. We're busy really in our selfish age thinking about self-fulfillment and self-obsession and how is my identity going to make me happy? That's what we see an identity about. It's about making me happy. But actually, those verses say that we're created for Him, for God. So our identity is not actually primarily for us. It's for Him and to give Him glory as He delights in us and as we delight in Him. So, we can't find happiness and peace in our identities that we're creating for ourselves. None of them can bear up that kind of weight. So the person at peace is the person that knows that who they are is made for God, from him and for him. That's who we are. And so we need to readjust our thinking about who we are, to think, actually, no, I'm not trying to create an identity for myself, but I want to be who he's made me to be and bring glory to him. And that's a fundamental flip of our thinking, but it's so important that we do that. And lastly, I want to say that our identity is eternal and not temporal. And that's what that 1 Corinthians 2 verse was about. You know, that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has even conceived of what God has planned for us in the future. We are made for eternity. We're not made for just the span of 70 years or 80 years or whatever we get. We're made for eternity, and we're eternal beings. And unless we see ourselves in that sense, then we'll always struggle with our identity. The great Dallas Willard once said this: the most important thing in your life is not what you do, it's who you become. You're an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe. That's the most important thing for you to know about you. We often don't think in terms of eternity, and yet we should. We think merely in terms of a temporal time frame, you know, what the next couple of years hold or whatever. And we build our identity around that, we build our choices around that. But actually we are made for eternity, and we will go on forever and have growing and maturing and developing in the presence of God for all time. And that's who we are, and we have a destiny within the universe that God is creating and making. So who I am is beyond even what I can think or imagine. And who I will be, as Paul said in that 1 Corinthians thing, is we can't even imagine who we will be. But when I think of my life in terms of that, it makes a heck of a difference to how I view my choices and lifestyle now. Because I'm being given something which cannot be taken from me. So our short-termism often creates bad choices for us. And, you know, we need to remember those eternal things that make us who we are, and that we will never lose. That we will never lose God's love and approval. And those things affect me now and make me into the person that God wants me to be. It's that call of eternity on our hearts. So short-termism and the fragility of the choices we make in making our identity around, those things that can all be taken away from us. But the eternal destiny we have can never be shaken, can never be removed. And those are the kind of identity things we'll be thinking about through the series. You know, it's that sense of, I don't know whether you've ever read Ecclesiastes. I love Ecclesiastes because it's written by Solomon, supposedly anyway, at the end of his life, and he's reviewing all his life and what he's done, and he thinks, well, I've had, and of course Solomon's writing this pre-Christ and pre the resurrection and the certainty of the future life and all the rest of it, and he reviews his life, and you know, Solomon had great wisdom and wealth, and he had so many wives, and he had learning in science and nature, and he said, I read books and I've done all this. And you know, he keeps saying, oh, it's all meaningless. It's all meaningless under the sun. You know, and he says, it doesn't make any sense. You know, I just lose it all at the end of my life. And that's how it is if we have this purely temporal time frame in our minds. But you and I are not temporal. We are eternal spiritual beings. And when I understand that and know that and live out of that, it radically changes my life. So there we are. There's just some foundations about identity. You know, it's not something that we create. It's derived from God. It's not something that we can develop in isolation, but it's in connection with him. It's not primarily for us, but for him, to bring glory to him and the kingdom. And it's also an eternal thing, not a temporal thing.